The morning my son fired me, he did it in front of everyone. I was sitting at the head of the long table in the boardroom of Vance Manufacturing, the company I built with my own 2 hands from a 1-car garage, and my son Scott stood up, buttoned his expensive jacket, and told the room that it was time for the company to move forward without its founder. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the board members, at the investors, at everyone but me. "Dad, we appreciate everything you've done," he said, in that smooth voice he'd learned at business school. "But this is a different world now. The company needs modern leadership. It needs someone who understands where the market is going, and with all due respect, you don't anymore. You're out of touch. It's time." Then he nodded toward the door, where 2 security guards I'd never seen before were standing. My son had hired security to walk his own father out of the building. 45 years. I started that company in 1980 with $900 and a used lathe. I employed 300 people, and my boy had me escorted out of the lobby like a stranger, past the front desk, past employees who'd known me for decades and couldn't meet my eyes, out into the parking lot in the cold. I stood by my truck and I did not shake. I want you to remember that, because everyone expected me to crumble. Because here is what my son did not know. Here is the mistake that was going to cost him everything. He had just fired me from my own company, and he had no idea that I still owned 60% of it. To understand how a father ends up standing in a parking lot, and what he did to take back everything that was stolen from him, I have to take you back. Because my son thought he'd won that morning. He thought he'd finally stepped out of his old man's shadow. What he'd actually done was start a war he had no idea he was going to lose. Before I tell you what Scott didn't understand about the company he thought he controlled, let me ask you one thing. If you believe a man's life's work should mean something, take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. It's the only way stories like mine ever get told. Now, let me take you back to how it all began. My name is Gordon Vance, and I built something real. I never went to college. I was a machinist, and a good one. And in 1980, with a wife named Ruth who believed in me more than I believed in myself, I rented a garage and started taking on the jobs the big shops didn't want. Precision parts, difficult tolerances, the work nobody else could do right. I did it right, every single time, and I did it when I said I would. Ruth kept the books at the kitchen table. I ran the machines until 2 in the morning, and slowly, one honest job at a time, that garage became a real shop, and the real shop became a real company, Vance Manufacturing. By the time I was in my 60s, we had a plant that covered 4 acres and 300 people on the payroll, 300 families who put food on the table because of something I started with, $900. Ruth and I gave everything to that place in the early years. We didn't take a vacation for a decade. We poured every dollar back into the shop. One more machine, one more good person. There were nights I'd come home so tired I'd fall asleep at the kitchen table, and I'd wake with a blanket over my shoulders that Ruth had laid there without a word. She never once told me to give up, not even in the lean years when we weren't sure we'd make payroll. "You're building something, Gordon," she'd say. "Don't you dare quit on it." I never did, and when she passed, a piece of that company went into the ground with her because she was in every brick of it. And those people were not numbers to me. I knew their names. I knew their kids' names. When Danny in shipping had a sick wife, I covered his medical bills and never told a soul. When old Pete Sorensen worked the same drill press for 31 years and finally retired, I gave him the machine to keep in his own garage because he loved it, and I made sure his pension was solid for the rest of his life. That's how we did things at Vance. You took care of the people who took care of you. It was that simple, and it was that important. When we hit a rough year, I took no salary before I laid off a single person. That company wasn't just my business, it was my family. It was the best thing I ever made, except for one, my son, Scott. I brought Scott up in that company, sweeping floors as a boy, running machines as a teenager, then off to get the fancy business degree I never had. And I was proud, God, I was proud, when he came back and started climbing. When Ruth got sick, I stepped back from the day-to-day and made Scott the CEO. I moved myself up to chairman, told everyone I was mostly retired, and I let my boy run the thing I loved. But there was always something in Scott that I couldn't quite reach. He was ashamed of me, I think. Ashamed that his father was a machinist with grease under his fingernails, ashamed of our modest house, ashamed that I still drove a 15-year-old truck. He wanted to be a big man, a player, and somewhere in there, being a big man became more important to him than anything else, more important in the end than his own father. There's one more thing you need to know, and it's the most important part of this whole story. Years ago, when the company was growing fast and I needed money to expand, I took on an investment, and when I did, I sat down with my attorney, a sharp woman named Ellen Park, who's looked after me for 30 years, and I did something careful. Something Ruth insisted on. I made sure that no matter who put money in, no matter what titles got handed out, I would always keep control of the company I built. Ellen structured it so that I held a special class of voting shares, 60% of the vote, always mine. I never talked about it. I never waved it around. Most people, including my own son, assumed that when I retired to chairman, I'd handed over the keys completely. Scott believed his title and the investors' money meant the company was his. He never once read the fine print. He never understood who actually held the votes. And that, more than anything, is what saved everything. If you've ever been written off by someone who should have known better, type the word underestimated in the comments. I read every single one. And stay with me, because what my son started planning behind my back is the part that still takes my breath away. It started with a man named Trent Marsh. Trent Marsh runs a private equity fund, and private equity, when it's the bad kind, works like this. They find a solid, healthy company that took decades to build. They buy it, they strip it down to the bone, they sell off the valuable pieces, they ship the jobs overseas, they fire everyone, and they flip whatever's left for an enormous profit. They don't build anything. They take things apart for money, and Trent Marsh had his eye on Vance Manufacturing. I found out slowly, the way you find out about a cancer, a comment here, a closed-door meeting there, Scott flying to the city more often, and then the loyal heart of that company, my longtime assistant, a woman named Dorothy who'd been with me for 30 years and who loved that place as much as I did. Dorothy came into my study one evening, closed the door, and told me everything, with tears in her eyes. Scott was going to sell the company to Trent Marsh, not to grow it, to gut it. The plan was to sell the plant, offshore the manufacturing, and lay off all 300 people, every family I'd spent 45 years protecting. And in exchange, Trent Marsh had privately promised my son an enormous personal payout on the side. A kickback, plain and simple, for delivering his father's company on a silver platter. But there was a problem for them. They knew that as long as I had any say at all, I would never, ever allow it. I would burn the whole thing down before I let them destroy those people's lives. So the first step of their plan, the thing they had to do before they could sell, was to get rid of me. To push me out, humiliate me, make me look like a senile old relic so no one would listen to me, and then ram the sale through a shareholder vote they were certain they controlled. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I told Dorothy she must have misunderstood, that Scott would never do this to those people. But she showed me what she'd found, a set of projections that spelled out the layoffs in cold numbers, 300 jobs reduced to a single line labeled workforce reduction, and there, in my son's own handwriting in the margin, was a note about his personal cut of the deal. That was the moment I stopped being able to pretend. My boy hadn't been swept up in something bigger than himself. He'd done the arithmetic with his own hand. He'd looked at every family in that plant and decided exactly what they were worth to him, and the answer was less than his payday. That's what the boardroom was. That's what the security guards were. It wasn't the end of their plan. It was the beginning. My own son was going to destroy my life's work and throw 300 families into the street to make himself rich, and he thought firing me was the hard part. I sat in my study that night after Dorothy left, and I'll be honest with you, I wept. Not for the company, for my boy, for the man I'd raised, who could look at 300 loyal people and see nothing but a payday. That grief nearly broke me. And then I dried my eyes, and I got very calm, and I decided to do what I've always done best. I decided to let them underestimate me all the way to the end. Because a suspicion is not a strategy. If I stormed into that boardroom shouting, they'd have called me exactly what they wanted to call me, a bitter, out-of-touch old man. No, I was going to let them fire me. I was going to walk out of that building quietly, with my head up, and let them believe they'd won. And then I was going to use the one thing they'd forgotten I had. The next morning, while my son was celebrating having pushed his father out, I drove to Ellen Park's office. I laid it all out for her, the sale, the kickback, all of it. And Ellen listened, and then she opened my file, and she smiled a small, hard smile. "Gordon," she said, "they can't sell anything. They can't do anything. You still hold 60% of the voting shares. Everything they're planning requires a shareholder vote, and you are the shareholder. They don't have the votes. They never did. They just don't know it yet." Then she told me the rest. Because that private kickback Trent Marsh had promised my son, that was Scott, as an officer of the company, secretly enriching himself in a deal against the company's own interest. That's a serious breach of his duty. It's the kind of thing that doesn't just lose you your job. It's the kind of thing that ends careers and starts investigations. And Dorothy, loyal Dorothy, had quietly kept copies of the emails that proved it. We had everything. Now it was just a matter of letting them walk all the way out onto the ledge. So I waited. And sure enough, within the week, Scott called a special shareholders meeting to vote on a major strategic transaction, the sale. He was so confident. He sent the notice to all shareholders as a formality, which meant, by law, he had to send one to me. Before I tell you what happened when I walked back into that boardroom, do me one small favor and subscribe if you haven't yet. You are going to want to see the look on his face. Now, back to that room. The day of the meeting, that boardroom was full. Scott at the head of the table, in the chair that used to be mine. Trent Marsh beside him, smiling like a man about to get paid. The board members who'd gone along with it, lawyers, everyone ready to vote through the sale, carve up my company, and end 300 jobs before lunch. And then the door opened, and I walked in. You could have heard a pin drop. Scott's face went from confusion to anger. "Dad," he said, "what are you doing here? You don't work here anymore. Security." "I'm here," I said calmly, "as a shareholder. I received a notice. I believe I'm entitled to attend and to vote." Scott actually laughed. "Dad, this is embarrassing. You don't have the votes for anything. Whatever little stake you kept, it doesn't matter. Go home." That's when Ellen Park stood up beside me, opened her folder, and laid a single document on the table. "Before this meeting proceeds," she said, "I'd like to enter into the record the certified capitalization table of Vance Manufacturing. As every person in this room is about to see, Mr. Gordon Vance holds a controlling 60% of the voting shares of this company. He has held them since 1994. Any transaction requires his approval, and he does not approve. I have never in my life seen a room change so fast. The color drained out of my son's face. Trent Marsh's smile died. The board members started looking at each other, then at their phones, then at the door. Because in one sentence, everything they thought they knew had just been turned upside down. The old man they'd escorted out of the building owned more of the company than all of them combined. One of the board members, a decent man named Harold, who I think had been swept along more than he'd ever led, put his head in his hands. Trent Marsh started quietly gathering his papers, already calculating how fast he could get out of that building. And through the glass walls of the boardroom, I could see a handful of my employees who drifted into the hallway, drawn by the commotion. Some of them had worked for me for 20 and 30 years. They didn't know yet that I had just saved every one of their jobs, but they saw the old founder settle back down into the chair at the head of the table, and I watched a few of them begin to smile. "That's not possible," Scott whispered. "You retired. You gave it up." "I retired from running it," I said. "I never once gave up owning it. You never asked. You just assumed. You assumed a lot of things about your old man." Then I sat down in the chair at the head of the table, my chair, and I went to work. Using my 60%, I voted down the sale to Trent Marsh, permanently. I voted to remove Scott as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. I voted to remove the 3 board members who had conspired with him. And then I turned to Trent Marsh, and I laid Dorothy's emails on the table, the ones documenting the secret payout he'd promised my son to betray his own company, and I told him that copies were already with the company's lawyers and would be shared with the appropriate authorities, and that he could see himself out of my building. He did, quickly. If you think this old man took back what was his, comment the word justice down below. I want to know you're out there with me. The sale was dead. The company was safe. And 300 families who had no idea how close they'd come to losing everything got to keep their jobs, their paychecks, and their futures, most of them never even knowing what I'd stopped in that room. But the hardest part of this story isn't the boardroom, it's my son. Because when it was over, Scott was finished at Vance Manufacturing. Not just fired, exposed. The secret deal he'd made, the duty he'd broken, it followed him. No serious company would touch him after that. He lost the payout, lost the position, lost the reputation he'd wanted more than he'd wanted his own father, and he blamed me for all of it. The last real conversation we had, he told me I'd humiliated him, as if I was the one who'd hired security to march his own father out into the cold. We don't speak now. I've reached out, he won't answer, and I've had to make my peace with the fact that somewhere along the way, I raised a son who chose to be a big man over being a good one, and that no amount of love from me was going to fix what was broken in him. A father's love doesn't die when his child breaks his heart. It just learns to live alongside the grief. But there was a light in it too. My granddaughter, Scott's daughter, Katie, 24 years old, came to see me a few weeks after it all happened. She sat in my study, ashamed of what her father had done, and she said, "Grandpa, I don't want to be like him. I want to learn to build something real, like you did." And so now, most mornings, Katie's down on the shop floor with me, learning the business from the ground up, grease under her fingernails, her great-grandmother Ruth's stubbornness in her eyes. That company will be in good hands one day after all. And Dorothy, loyal Dorothy, who risked her own job to warn me and kept the emails that saved us all. Dorothy is now the Vice President of Operations, with a salary to match and the gratitude of an old man who will never forget what she did. Kindness has a way of coming back around when you least expect it. Sometimes it comes back and saves everything you ever built. A month after it was all over, I called a meeting of the whole company, all 300 of them, out on the shop floor where I'd spent my entire life. I didn't tell them the details. I just told them that there had been an attempt to sell the company out from under them and end their jobs, that it had failed, and that as long as I drew breath, Vance Manufacturing would remain exactly what it had always been, a place that takes care of its people. I have never heard a room get so loud. Men and women I'd worked beside for decades, cheering, some of them wiping their eyes. That sound was worth more to me than any fortune Trent Marsh ever dangled in front of my son. I'm back at the head of that table now, at least until Katie's ready. 300 people still have their jobs. The garage where I started it all is a framed photograph on my office wall. And every time I look at it, I think about how close I came to losing everything, because a room full of people decided that an old man in a cheap coat couldn't possibly matter anymore. So if there's anything I'd want you to take from an old man's story, it's this. The work you do, the things you build, the people you take care of, that has worth, no matter how old you get, and no matter who tries to tell you otherwise. Never let anyone convince you that your time is over, and never ever underestimate the quiet man at the end of the table. They fired me from my own company and marched me out into the parking lot. They forgot to ask who actually owned it. If my story meant something to you tonight, subscribe so you never miss another one, and tell me honestly in the comments, have you ever been written off by the very people who should have believed in you? I read every single reply. Thank you for sitting a while with an old man who built something real. I'll see you in the next story.